Welcome to Westminster Watch with me, Nick Dubois. Coming up on the show, has the European Commission's president gone rogue over EU foreign policy towards Israel and the Hamas conflict? A decision to suspend EU aid to Palestine was quickly reversed. Just who is in charge of foreign policy? And what are the limits to free speech as pro-Palestinian rallies are banned in France and Germany? Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has been praised for her leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic and her handling of the war in Ukraine. But a recent trip to Israel has led to some criticism from the president of the EU Council and European capitals, who have accused her of overstepping her authority. Von der Leyen said the EU stands with Israel, but failed to say anything about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Irish MEP Claire Daly slammed von der Leyen for hypocrisy. The EU did little to convince world leaders that it has a coherent foreign policy after coming under fire from its own member states when EU Commissioner Oliver Várhelyi suspended aid to Palestine after the Hamas attack. The announcement was reversed some 5 hours later. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell criticised Várhelyi, insisting that the suspension of the payments punishing all the Palestinian people would have damaged the EU interests in the region. Some European countries have banned pro-Palestinian protests, prompting human rights groups to worry about free speech and assembly. France's highest administrative court upheld the Interior Minister's order banning all pro-Palestinian protests, but ordered a case-by-case prohibition. The Interior Minister stated in a note to regional police chiefs that pro-Palestinian protests must be banned because they are likely to disrupt public order. And joining us today is Lord Peter Lilly, former Conservative Trade and Industry Minister, Chris Doyle, Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding, and Dennis McShane, former Minister of State for Europe. Gentlemen, welcome. Chris, if I could turn to you first, please. The President of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, she was very quick to go to Israel, but with the criticism that was levelled at her after her trip by her contemporaries, as well as the capitals of Europe, she was basically accused of not being representative of a united EU view. As such, she didn't charge Israel, as they would say, with respecting international law. Do you think her visit did more harm than good?
One can understand why, after that savage attack that killed, a Hamas attack that killed 1,300 people, the seizing of hostages, why international leaders wanted to go out to Israel to show solidarity. But as the head of a union of nations, 27 bloc, not being able to carry them with you, I think left her rather vulnerable. And I think by the time she got there, there were fears of an Israeli ground invasion to go after the bombardment, and that it could look as if somehow she would be endorsing those sorts of actions. And this, for certain EU member states and their leaderships, was seen as rather precarious. So I think she meant well, but I think she needed to work harder to bring others with her. The EU is divided on this issue. It was much easier in the days when there were 15 states, but now you have 27. You have a lot of East European nations, Hungary, Poland, and perhaps until the recent elections, and others who have been courted by Israel, who have adopted a far more pro-Israeli position. And then there is largely Western European and Scandinavian states who have been far more sympathetic for international law. And it's that international legal perspective that I think is really at the root of this. And I've been talking to Palestinians in Gaza and people working for aid agencies since all of this started. And the sense that the leadership of the world, and including in Europe, were abandoning them is acute. Why do they hate us is one thing that was asked. And I think that there were some in the European leadership who were saying they've declared a siege, the deliberate cutting off of water, electricity, food and power. That's against all 0.2 million Palestinian civilians. Now, that shouldn't happen. We condemned it when it was Russia doing it in Ukraine. We condemned it when the Syrian regime was conducting sieges in Syria. It doesn't look good if we're seen to approve of that. And I don't think enough people have spoken out about that. I don't think it is a legitimate tool to use as self-defense. Israel has that right. But to deprive civilians of that is wrong. And right now, we are looking at a situation where, people are actually at risk of dying of dehydration in Gaza. That's unconscionable. The taps have to be turned back on. So I think at the time there were concerns that there wasn't enough pushback to Israel to keep within the parameters of international law in whatever actions it took.
Dennis, a former Minister of State for Europe, Chris has explained why it's hard to get a common position from 27 member states. I mean, von der Leyen may have faced criticism, but actually wasn't she just filling a vacuum and showing leadership rather than necessary arrogance, which is what some of her critics within the Commission have said?
Well, I don't know who these critics are. I know
Josep Borrell was very unhappy with it, the head of Foreign Affairs.
Josep Borrell is a lovely Spanish guy, former leader of the Socialist Party. He's a Catalan. He's been very brave in resisting Catalan nationalism. Yes, he thinks he has a title of High Representative. There's also a President of the European Council. You've not mentioned him, Charles Michel. He represents the 27 heads of state. Ursula represents the Commission. The Commission is the only international organisation, state organisation, giving serious money to the Palestinians. So she has a little skin in the game. I just think that it was necessary for someone to go down there. She broke the logjam very quickly. Joe Biden followed. That was good. Before him, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was there. No reporting in the British press at all. A much bigger economic power, and one that has a much deeper problematic relationship with Israel for very obvious reasons, and actually with the biggest, most politicised Muslim population amongst its citizens, namely all the German Turkish people. So now we're finding Macron might be going down there. Rishi Sunak's gone down there. I don't know whether he's going to pander to the hard right of the Conservative Party is very, very pro-Israel because it's anti-European. It's a weird connection. They like Bibi Netanyahu, whereas I think he's a complete disaster as Israeli Prime Minister, and I hope he goes soon. But I'll leave that for Peter to bring up that point. I don't think there's basically, the EU can't have a easy foreign policy because each country has got passionate views on aspects of foreign policy.
Well, all right, that's a fair point. But Peter, may I put this to you? Ursula von der Leyen herself said when she came to office as the President of the Commission that she will make the EU the geopolitical force. I mean, is what she's doing now a hint of desperation as she comes to the end of her term to rush out there and make foreign policy on the hoof?
Well, she can't make it a major geopolitical force because it's 27 different countries who have their own opinions. It takes a while to get them to cohere around a central position. And that was true over the Ukraine, it's true now. And it's a very difficult issue. One doesn't want to show the slightest equivocation about condemning Hamas and supporting Israel. At the same time, one's got to recognise that terrible things may happen to civilians in Palestine. Getting the right balance between that is quite difficult. So, even if there'd been an easy, hadn't been 27 people to get agreement, it would have been a problem. But at the end of the day, an organisation, a country, its power, someone once said, the power a country can exercise depends on force divided by distance multiplied by will. If you're a long way away, you can make big noise is it has relatively little effect. Only if you can deploy force locally, which the Americans can, even though they're a long way away. If you've got money, which of course is a force power, and that's the one lever the EU can exercise, that's important. But its will is inevitably a bit diffuse because it's 27 different countries.
But therefore, shouldn't it just, Chris, be a humanitarian aid giver, just a very large one giving lots of money out? It seems obsessed with trying to stomp the, shall we say, the global stage of diplomacy and doesn't seem to have achieved very much there at all.
Well, the EU actually has far more at stake in this because this area, actually, there's a real and very dangerous risk of escalation. I mean, what if we get to a situation, heaven forbid, that Israel and Hezbollah start having a war? If we have huge refugee flows, they're probably not going to land up in the United States, and they may well land up within the European Union. So there is actually a vested interest in trying to get to a ceasefire, a proper long-term political solution. And I think internationally, in so many conflicts that I'm dealing with, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, Sudan, there's been far too much leaving them alone and being content with that, without the realisation that if you leave these conflicts alone, and Palestine perhaps being the longest of the lot, the problems don't go away, they get worse. You get more hatred, the problems become harder to solve, and I think that we need to develop far more expertise and put far more resources into conflict prevention and resolution. That, I hope, will be the end product of this. But we do have a stake as Europe. And if we don't take action to try to stop this, we could be really suffering ourselves.
I saw you shaking your head at the beginning of that question. Now, I don't know if that is a reaction to my summary that, in fact, why don't the EU just stick to humanitarian aid? Because actually, I'm wondering, what can they achieve diplomatically?
Well, that's silly, because they represent governments who
But they're not united,
present.
are they?
No society is united, and governments can change their positions very quickly. I don't quite remember when Peter first entered Parliament, but you were not allowed to call Irish nationalists anything other than terrorists. And Mrs Thatcher said they shouldn't be allowed to be on the BBC. We must deprive them of the oxygen of publicity. Close your eyes, open them, and there's the Queen with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. I mean, let us get real. Let us not forget how Israel was founded, with 2 British sergeants swinging from a tree. That was, to put it mildly, a terrorist act, and the blowing up of the King David Hotel. All a long time ago, we forget about it. But in fact, Europe, I would say on the whole, I was talking to a Greek political friend of mine in earlier this year, and I said, well, what actually is Greece's policy on Ukraine? He said, Europe's. In other words, your prime ministers, heads of government go there, they may not be experts, they hear common sense, and on Ukraine, Europe has been remarkably united, now giving more arms and money than the United States.
OK, well, let me test that, if I may, with you. Sorry to cut you off, but I think we should move it on to this very question you're raising, because the suggestion has been made that there's some question over the relevance of the EU in global foreign affairs. And, Dennis, I'll stick with you, if I may, on this, because if they are struggling to get a coherent response on this issue and others, how can they be relevant? For example, I remind you of Kissinger's famous phrase, who do you call in Europe? I'd go further than say the phone's not ringing anymore in Europe. President Biden, he didn't include them on his conference calls when he was first looking how to address this problem. It was France, it was Germany, it was the United Kingdom.
Quite rightly so. I mean, Europe does not have boots on the ground, but if you go to Japan, for example, the last time I checked, quite an important country, I was there as minister in charge of Japan before I became minister for Europe and other Asian countries, and I found a very nice British embassy where I think 2 people spoke Japanese, not very well. You go to the EU delegation, it was called, their mission, and everybody speaks fluent Japanese. And I just said, to complete agreement of my British FCO colleagues there, get on down, make friends with these guys. They're going to know far more about Japan than you'll ever be able to get with the limited language skills you have. So Britain by itself, France by itself, is not going to be a player. Europe can be. It isn't normally, it has to tread so carefully because of anybody. I mean, Mrs. von der Leyen wouldn't have gone to Israel without clearing it with all European heads of
Well,
government.
it does sound like some of them, including France, may have cleared her visit, but didn't clear the common agreement. But I noticed you weren't agreeing there with Denis Mukwege.
I wasn't agreeing about Japan. The Japanese embassy, the British embassy in Japan when I was there, was famous for having the best Japanese speakers. I think it's a bit silly just to attack your own country.
I was just saying we add value, Peter, which you don't like because it involves Europe.
On the world stage?
I'm all in favour of cooperating with Europe and with France and Germany, America, to the extent it's relevant. I think we tend to exaggerate the influence that visits have, that statements have. What really matters is the potential to deploy power and deploy money. The visit of Biden was very important because America is the most important country in the world. It can deploy force. And he made the very important point, I'm no fan of Biden normally, but saying don't make mistakes we've made.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful point. And if
You're talking about post 9/11?
Yes.
Did you vote for Iraq, by the way, Peter? I think you probably did.
Only with my fingers crossed.
Doesn't
and having
matter. I mean,
pointed out that it was
I
all
did
rubbish.
too. Every Prime Minister before Liz Truss voted for Iraq. I'd like to see all those Prime Ministers issue a joint statement today saying, that was a mistake. Please, dear friends in Israel, don't make that same mistake again.
Chris?
Here, I mean, I think if you look at the international community collectively on this issue right now, I think that they have failed really with the primary duty of trying to get to resolve the conflict. For example, we had the British Prime Minister saying unequivocal support for Israel. Now, I don't think in any conflict you should use the word unequivocal support for one party in the conflict or another, because that's interpreted as a green light. You're going to get support whatever you do. Offer support, but it should always be limited by those very clear parameters of international law, particularly in a conflict that has had such longevity, such bitterness, such hatred, and indeed with a government in Israel, let's face it, it's probably the most extreme in its history. So I think that there was a failure. We should, as the international community, we're not participant in this conflict, we should be standing back and trying to make sure that parties that are suffering great lots of anger and trauma and everything else, we're meant to be the cool-headed ones. We're meant to be the ones who are saying, there's not going to be a military solution to this, short of ethnic cleansing. Nobody wants that. We've got to get to the diplomacy to deal with this. And I think that only now are we starting to see that really happening. But given the pace and the severity of events, it's been too slow. So I fear that we're living in a world, in too many of these conflicts, we haven't seen the sort of international statesmanship that we used to get, where people thought of not of their own narrow political interests or tomorrow's headlines, but actually, how do you resolve these big issues? And that, I think, is a big problem. It stretches far wider than the Israel-Palestine question, in all sorts of other issues as well.
Let me give you some context, picking up on your point here about the American engagement. And you said, Peter, that actually America's engagement on this and that post 9/11 message was very important. Isn't the reality that when we are talking about the relevance of and influence of EU foreign policy as an institution, isn't the brutal truth that the easier option is actually to rely on Washington in these international diplomatic efforts? And that, frankly, is because they've got the military capability to back up their foreign policy. Isn't it always going to be that?
Yes, and unless and until Europe has its own army, navy and air force, it won't ever be able to exert the power of a country which does have its own army, navy and air force. The United Kingdom is much smaller than Europe. We have got but we can deploy a certain amount of forces, and we have done. Therefore, that gives us a small degree of influence that we wouldn't otherwise have. But I would hope that behind the scenes, they're all asking the Israeli government the general Petraeus question: how does it all end?
Well, Joe Biden asked that actually yesterday to the Israeli cabinet and said, "What's your plan for the end day?" And there was no answer. That was what was reported. But I think that it works very well if you want to rely on the US, a US that wants to engage with the world. But what happens when we have a US that we've seen all too recently that doesn't really want to engage with the world? We had a very isolationist President Trump. Joe Biden and Barack Obama, in some ways, were trying to pull out of various areas of the world, not so interested in Europe, for example. So it works if the United States is prepared to take up that role.
Excellent. Let's move on, if I may, to our third point. I have two former parliamentarians, well, one existing parliamentarian here, but in the Lords, not the Commons. But a question for you all. Is France right to have banned demonstrations that were pro-Palestinian last week? And we know there's more coming up. Peter, let me start with you.
I'm very much against banning demonstrations. The issue didn't really come up except in that broadcasting thing with the IRA. But if people wish to express support for the IRA, I was under a death threat from the IRA. But I still don't want to stop demonstrations in the street. Now, if people start making threats to Jewish people, or come to that, to Muslim people, then that is against the law. They should be arrested and charged with that. But a demonstration that expresses support for one side or the other should not be prevented as long as it doesn't involve invoking or trying to instigate force and hatred against the other.
Chris, very briefly, because I know you can't solve this problem, but the streets of Paris, Berlin or London, that we're not going to solve the Israeli, Gaza and wider Palestinian issues, are we? But let me say, there's very little talk about resurrecting the two-state solution. Do you think that events of the last several days have killed off the two-state solution? Or do you think, actually, given your understanding of the region, it may even be a catalyst?
I doubt it would be a catalyst. I think that one has to remember on this issue that there was, the crisis didn't begin on the 7th of October. So Gaza was already in a humanitarian crisis on the 6th. There's a lot of awareness about that. There is a lot of anger. That does not excuse those people who don't condemn Hamas for what they did. They absolutely should. I mean, I think it was a bit too blanket from Dennis on there. I think a lot of people who are demonstrating fully understand that. But they were seeing also, and bearing in mind that this is the 6th Israeli major bombardment of Gaza, they know what was happening and what is about to happen. And I think there was a great identity with those Palestinian civilians there too. I spoke to the organisers of the march. I expressed my reservations because I feared what hotheads might stir up. There is always that. But you have to understand also, particularly now, as this gets so serious, there is even more anger. In terms of what's the solution is, to be quite honest, we have to get out of this immediate tumult, the whole thing. I'm not saying that we should sit down and there's a political negotiation or agreement with Hamas. Hamas can, but there needs to be parties in the region to find some way around. We're not going to be able to bomb our way to a solution.
But it would take.
There's no military way that you're going to get to, unless you want ethnic cleansing, Dennis.
No.
You've got to have, some way resolving
But
this.
Chris, wouldn't it take the actual removal of Hamas before any serious peace negotiations
Well, it
could
would take the return of the hostages. That is
Definitely.
the huge block.
More important.
Well, at this stage, let's take it one stage at a time. I'm totally with Chris. You want me to list all the mistakes and stupidities of the Israeli government? We haven't got time. But you can't do it while hostages are being held. I think there was an agreement, Peter, probably before you were in the government, all the IRA terror campaigns in the 70s and 80s, of the cabinet saying if one of us is taking hostage, we don't try and get that person. We make no concessions to get that person back. But the hostages have to come home.
Dennis, on that note, I'm sure we can all agree. Lord Lilly, Chris Doyle and Dennis McShane, thank you very much in joining us here today. Thanks again to my guests for joining me, and don't forget to check out TRT World for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.